The president has a new national security advisor tonight. He named Army Lieutenant General H R McMaster today, a week after retired General Michael Flynn was forced out and after the first choice for a replacement turned it down. Retired Army Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg will serve as the Security Council's chief of staff. Mr. Trump made the announcement at his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida.
He's a man of tremendous talent and tremendous experience. I watched and read a lot over the last 2 days. He is highly respected by everybody in the military, and we're very honored to have him.
I'd just like to say what a privilege it is to be able to continue serving our nation. I'm grateful to you for that opportunity, and I look forward to joining the national security team and doing everything I can to advance and protect the interests of the American people. Thank you very much, sir.
You're going to do a great job.
For some background on H R McMaster, he is 54 years old and currently a 3-star general in the U.S. Army. He graduated from West Point in 1984 and later earned a Ph.D. in military history. His doctoral thesis about the failures of military and political leadership during the Vietnam War later became a well-regarded book titled Dereliction of Duty. During the first Gulf War with Iraq in 1991, he led a tank unit that prevailed against Iraq's powerful Republican Guard. He also led American forces in Iraq in 2005 and successfully brought stability to a city that had been rife with ethnic conflict. For more on all this, we turn to Washington Post reporter Greg Jaffe. He's known McMaster for years. Greg Jaffe, welcome back to the program. You were just telling me you've known him, what, for 14 years?
Yeah, I think 2002.
2002. What should we know about him?
He's fiercely opinionated. He's very, very smart. He's passionate. He's funny. He understands the media, I think, and talks to reporters, interestingly. I don't think he views them as the enemy. I think the one knock against him is when he believes he's right, he passionately argues that point and he doesn't stop. And I think after a while that can be too much for folks.
Tell me about his military career. We were just reporting that he had a very successful career during the first Iraq, the Gulf War. Mm-hmm. What made him so successful?
Well, during the first Gulf War, he was involved in the Battle of 73 Easting there, and so he was a tank company commander, and his tank company prevailed against a much larger unit of the Iraqi Republican Guard. His real fame, though, came later in Iraq in 2006.
And what made him so successful?
His group, I think the New Yorker described them as, his unit in Iraq as rebels against an incoherent strategy, was a great line from the New Yorker. And at that time, the strategy in the U.S. was the U.S. strategy in Iraq was we'll stand down as the Iraqis stand up. It was training the Iraqi forces. He went against that and said, look, we can't train the Iraqi forces until we've stabilized this situation. So he pushed his troops into the city of Tel Afar, established 29 outposts in the city, and really stopped the killing and the violence, and then focused on rebuilding. So it became a strategy known as clear, hold, and build.
Clear, hold, and build. How is he viewed, Greg Jaffe, by the rest of the Army, by the military?
I think in many cases with great admiration because he's so frank, he's so smart. It's interesting, though, when he was promoted from colonel to 1-star, he was passed over for promotion to 1-star general twice. And I think in some cases that was a reflection on how frank he can be. He doesn't hold back his opinions, and sometimes that rubs folks the wrong way.
Is there a political philosophy there, or are you talking about a philosophy of war, of fighting? A
philosophy of war and fighting. He is not a political guy in any way, shape, or form, and I think that's interesting too. I don't think he'll bring, he won't bring very sharp political instincts on the downside. On the upside, he's not a political ideologue. He has very strong opinions about war, though.
You were telling me, we were talking about how you said he's a prolific writer. He's written a lot we were looking today at the website for the Hoover Institution, conservative think tank. A lot of it is about military strategy and leadership he writes about.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And for the New York Times, I was just reading an op-ed he wrote for the New York Times, which begins by quoting Saul Bellow, which, is not something you normally hear from a U.S. Army officer.
Do you think, based on what you know about him, you were also saying, Greg Jaffe, that he hasn't spent a lot of time in Washington. How do you see him fitting into the city? And he's going smack to the middle of power at the White House.
Yeah, I think that will be interesting. You know, he has dealt a lot in Talafar, and then in Iraq he ran in Afghanistan he ran an anti-corruption task force for General Petraeus in 2010. And so that meant he had to deal with a lot of arms of government. He had to deal with the State Department. He had to deal with the intelligence agencies, all those things that you have to deal with as a national security advisor. He hasn't spent a lot of time thinking and worrying about politics in Washington, and I think that's going to be a challenge and a stretch for him, because the national security advisor job isn't fundamentally a political job, but he certainly has to take D.C. politics into account.
Well, just quickly, he's going to have a military man as his chief of staff, Keith Kellogg. He's going to be dealing, of course, with a retired general at the Pentagon. So we're seeing a lot of military people in this administration.
Yeah, that's right, and it's going to be, it'll be interesting. That's an interesting dynamic, isn't it?
Well, it's not a position that requires confirmation by the Senate. So this is the president's choice. But and it sounds like he's somebody very different from Michael Flynn. Yeah, I think he is. He's widely. I think Flynn was widely respected in the Army, but I think he's seen as a much more sort of a steadying figure than Flynn would be, much less of an erratic figure. Greg Jaffe with the Washington Post. Thank you so much. Sure. Thanks for having me.